let's dive into one of the most famous and, frankly, one of the most difficult stories ever told. We're talking about Abraham's test. You probably think you know it, but there's a whole other story hiding just under the surface.
I mean, just think about the setup here. It's so raw. You have a father, Abraham, who's waited his entire life for this son, Isaac. He and Sarah are old, this is the child of promise, and then, boom, he gets this absolutely impossible command from God. A command that just goes against everything. Logic, love, what it means to be a father. He's told to sacrifice his own son.
So, that's the big question we're asking today. Is the story we've all heard the whole story? Because let me tell you, once you start digging a little deeper, things get complicated. We're talking about mind-bending philosophical problems, a secret history buried in the very ground the story takes place on, and, get this, a huge mystery in the text itself about which son was actually on that altar.
Okay, so first things first. Let's do a quick recap of the story we all know from Genesis chapter 22. It's set up as this ultimate test of faith, right? God calls out to Abraham, the guy who finally has Isaac, the son he's been waiting for forever, and then comes that absolutely crushing command. And the story itself is just so intense. You've got the command. Then Abraham and Isaac take this long, quiet 3-day journey to a place called Moriah. Can you imagine that walk? He gets there, he builds the altar, he actually ties up his own son, and he raises the knife. And just then, at the last possible second, an angel steps in and stops him. A ram appears, caught in a thicket, and it's sacrificed instead. Abraham passes the test. Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Well, not so fast.
Okay, now we're going to get into the part that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. Because let's just pause the story for a second and think about what's actually happening here. When you do, you run headfirst into a massive ethical problem.
Yeah, exactly. Let's just call it what it is. How is this not murder? I mean, by any moral code we live by, what Abraham was prepared to do is the worst thing you can possibly imagine. So how on earth do we celebrate it as this incredible act of faith? This is the exact paradox that a philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard became obsessed with.
This quote from Kierkegaard really nails it. He wrote this incredible book called Fear and Trembling, where he wrestled with this story, and he came up with this really famous idea. He called it a teleological suspension of the ethical. Now, that's a mouthful, I know, but what it basically means is that Abraham had to put the universal rules of morality, don't kill people, on hold for a higher purpose. And that higher purpose was his personal, direct relationship with God. So for Kierkegaard, it's like there are these two separate worlds. On one hand, you've got the ethical. This is our shared reality, the world of laws and reason that we all agree on. And in that world, Abraham is about to commit a horrific crime. But then there's the religious sphere. This is totally different. It's a private, one-on-one connection with God. And in that world, Abraham is what Kierkegaard calls the knight of faith. The crazy part is, he can't explain himself to anyone in the ethical world. If he tried, they'd think he was completely insane.
And this leads us to probably Kierkegaard's most famous idea, the leap of faith. It's the only way to make sense of what Abraham did. It's this act of just letting go of reason, of abandoning universal ethics, and putting all your trust in that private relationship with the divine. It's something you can't prove or explain to anyone else. And for Kierkegaard, that is the core of real faith. It's terrifying, and it doesn't make logical sense, but that's the point.
All right, but the story isn't just about heavy philosophy. The place where all this happens, the land of Moriah, is a huge piece of the puzzle. It turns out this location wasn't just some random hill. It's a spot that is just packed with history and meaning. Check this out. This one single spot has layers and layers of history. Way before this test, a priest king named Melchizedek blessed Abraham right there. Then, fast forward about 1,000 years, King David buys that exact piece of land to build an altar. And after him, his son Solomon builds the first temple on that very spot. It becomes the absolute center of worship for the entire nation. And here's the verse from the Bible that connects it all. It says Solomon built the temple on Mount Moriah. So think about that. The place of Abraham's greatest test, where God provided a ram, becomes the most sacred site in Judaism. Even the name Moriah is linked to the Hebrew word for provision. The land itself is telling a story here, showing this spot as a special point of connection with the divine for thousands of years. But okay, we've talked philosophy, we've talked geography, now let's get into the real textual detective work, because there's a huge debate hiding in plain sight, right there in the words of the original command. Now, for most of history, if you're coming from a Jewish or Christian perspective, the answer is obvious. The son on the altar was Isaac. If you're coming from an Islamic tradition, the answer is it was his older half-brother, Ishmael. But what's really interesting is that if you just look at the biblical text itself with fresh eyes, some really tough questions pop up.
So here it is. This is the verse that causes all the trouble. God says, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac." Now it seems clear, right? It names Isaac. But that little phrase, "your only son," well, that's where the problem starts.
Why is it a problem? Because of this number, 14. For 14 years, Abraham did have an only son. From the time his firstborn Ishmael was born until Isaac came along, Ishmael was his one and only. So when God gave this command, Abraham actually had two sons. Isaac was factually not his only son.
So let's break down the arguments from the text. The case for Isaac is pretty simple. His name is right there in the verse. Plus, he's the son of the big promise made to Sarah. But the case for Ishmael is also really compelling if you're just reading the text. He was literally the only son for 14 years. He was the firstborn, and this is a big one. God's covenant promise also included him. God promised to make a great nation from him. He was even brought into that covenant through circumcision before Isaac was even born. It's such a strong contradiction that some scholars have actually wondered if the name Isaac was added to the story later on.
Okay, so where does all this leave us? What started as a simple, if terrifying story has exploded into this massive web of questions about faith, morality, history, and even the text itself. Think about all the layers we've uncovered. You've got the story as a test of pure, absolute faith. Then there's the philosophical nightmare of ethics versus a divine command. We've dug into the deep history of the very mountain it happened on. And of course, there's that textual mystery that makes you question who the story is even about.
And you know what? Maybe that's the whole point. The reason this story has stuck with us for thousands of years isn't because it gives us an easy answer. Its real power is in the questions it demands we ask. It shoves us right to the edge of what we think we know about right and wrong, and it leaves us with that one massive, haunting question: what does it truly mean to believe?